I remember the first time I felt it, a silence that shaped my choices, a look that rearranged my thoughts without a single word. The room was full, laughter spilling like cheap wine, and yet everything shrank to the edge of a smile. She sat across the way, a small tilt of the head, a measured blink, and the crowd became background noise. My hand moved before I knew why. The scrape of a chair, the way light caught the corner of her jaw, the deliberate delay before she answered. Each small thing became an instruction I obeyed without asking. There is a hunger in those moments, not for truth but for control. You feel it first as unease, then as a subtle retilt of your priorities. You decide later that you chose freely. But choices are built on the scaffolding of attention. Whoever commands attention commands outcome. These are the invisible rules, the laws that govern influence while mouths keep moving about trivialities. Look closely. Micro pauses that force you to fill silence. Compliments calibrated just wide of praise so you chase validation. Attention parceled out like currency, given sparingly to make you consume more. Tiny moves, surgical. They bypass reason because they speak to the parts of you that run on habit. The reflexive mind that wants social belonging. Approval, the soft lie that says, I belong here. If you let them, these unspoken laws will make your decisions for you. They will reroute your loyalties, your appetite, your sleep. So this is a warning. Anchor yourself. Name the sensation when your chest tightens. Count 3 slow breaths. Notice where your eyes go when the silence settles. Teach your body to wait. I will name 5 laws, 5 hidden structures that shape every manipulation you mistake for charm. But first, learn to see the hush before it becomes a command. The more I think back, the more I realize the terrain was already mapped before I ever stepped onto it. Every gesture, every silence, every interruption of rhythm had been sculpted long before I believed I was free to choose. The manipulator is never loud. They are a sculptor of perception. They chip away at your certainty, carve angles into your confidence, and polish your insecurities until you shine with the shape they want you to take. The scene is never obvious. It's not an interrogation, not a battle of words, not a clash of wills. It's the slow drip, the rearrangement of what feels natural. A friend laughs a little too hard at a story that isn't funny. A lover withdraws their gaze right when you reach for it, so you strain harder next time. A colleague delays their answer just enough to make you doubt the strength of your idea. It's subtle. Too subtle to point at without sounding paranoid. But it works. At first I mistook it for charm. Curiosity kept me leaning closer, convinced that there was something profound beneath the surface. But curiosity becomes erosion when every answer leaves you hungrier. I began to doubt myself, to question my memory, to rehearse conversations late at night as if trying to find the moment I slipped. That's when I began to notice the patterns, not accidents, not quirks, but laws. Law 1, the quiet claim. Power enters without announcement. A quiet claim is made not with words, but with presence. It could be a pause held 1 second too long, a silence that obligates you to speak first. It could be a hand placed on the table, not aggressively, but in a way that subtly marks territory. It could be the refusal to rush, the willingness to let the air grow tense until you yield. The claim is invisible, but it anchors itself in your spine. You recognize it before you understand it. Law 2, the mirror debt. Every reflection creates obligation. When someone mirrors your tone, your rhythm, your language, you feel seen. When they confess a small wound after you confess one of your own, you believe in balance. But mirrors are not free. Every reflection builds a ledger of debts you never agreed to. I shared, so you must share more. I bent toward you, so you must bend farther. The mirror builds loyalty while never paying the cost of loyalty. And by the time you notice, you are already knee-deep in the debt. I saw it in fragments at first. A late-night conversation where she dropped a story halfway through, leaving me begging for the ending. A gift too perfectly timed, arriving not in abundance but at the edge of conflict, making my anger feel ungrateful. A phrase repeated often enough that it became gospel in my mind, though I could not remember where it started. Staged vulnerability, selective omission, the soft push disguised as choice. These were not accidents. They were choreography, and the more I traced them, the more I felt the erosion of trust, not only in her, but in myself. I asked myself why it worked. The answer is older than language. We are wired to chase what withdraws. Our attention hooks to scarcity. Our desire sharpens where it is denied. To be seen, even briefly, is to feel chosen. and that illusion is enough to rearrange entire loyalties. Evolution gave us this flaw. Attention is currency, and we pay it blindly. But here is the cold truth. You cannot fight these laws by refusing to feel. You fight them by cataloging your feelings as evidence. Each moment of unease, each skipped heartbeat, each irritation you dismiss, write them down in the ledger of betrayals. Patterns emerge only when you collect them. The manipulator thrives on the chaos of memory, on your tendency to forgive moments as isolated accidents. Do not forgive, record. I admit, I almost surrendered. I wanted the mirror. I wanted the claim. I wanted the easy current of being pulled instead of resisting. It feels like warmth when you are cold, like gravity when you are drifting. But every comfort was a bargain, every intimacy a hook. And when I laid awake counting the small betrayals, the sudden endings of stories, the delayed replies, the way silence became command, I saw the ledger grow heavy. 1 betrayal is forgivable. 10 can be explained. 100 becomes a structure. And when you finally see the structure, when the weight of the ledger presses into your chest, you cannot return to blindness. That is when the erosion stops and the observation begins. And so I began to watch. I turned inward. The younger version of me, restless, hungry, still desperate for proof that I mattered, sits across from the present version who has finally learned how to watch in silence. Between us, in the shadow, is the figure who taught me, not through lessons, but through wounds. She never admitted she was teaching. She never wanted to. But every omission, every pause, every carefully placed silence carved itself into my memory until the scar spelled meaning. The conflict was always the same. I was drawn to the power of being seen, and I despised the sensation of being toyed with. To be read so easily is to feel naked in a room full of clothed people. You cannot pretend you are not trembling when someone names the shiver before you notice it yourself. There is a strange seduction in that, the intimacy of being known, but also the disgust of realizing that your own transparency is not affection, it's leverage. This is where I learned Law 3, the attention auction. Every human trades attention, but not everyone knows the price. The manipulator does. Attention is offered, then withdrawn, then dangled again like meat before a starving dog. And when you are starved, the smallest crumbs feel like a feast. A half smile becomes enough to undo days of silence. A single reply, perfectly delayed, outweighs 10 previous rejections. We bid higher and higher, until the act of waiting becomes more consuming than the act of receiving. Withdrawal hurts more than cruelty. Cruelty is sharp. It ends quickly. It bleeds, but then it clots. Withdrawal is slower. It carves hollows in the ribs, keeps you awake rehearsing conversations, makes you replay the last word you heard, as if dissecting a prophecy. It trains. You like a dog, not with punishment, but with intermittent reward. I remember the nights most clearly. The glow of my phone, unanswered messages hanging like hooks in the air. The stomach jitter that came not from anger but from absence. Cruelty would have been cleaner, silence stretched into madness. And then, without warning, the reply would land. Short. Sweet. A single word that erased the hours of hunger. That's the trick of the auction. It convinces you that the scarcity is proof of value. You think, if it cost me this much, it must be worth it. The humiliations were small, but they were cumulative. Compliments rehearsed in my head before I dared speak them aloud, falling flat, echoing like coins on stone. The metallic taste of words given too freely, while hers came sparingly, each one carrying more weight than mine. I remember laughing. Too hard, leaning too far, asking questions with my eyes when my mouth had already said enough. And when I laid awake at night, I replayed them all like a series of crime scenes. Where had I gone wrong? Which gesture exposed my hunger? Which silence was the trap I failed to resist? But observation, even painful observation, is the seed of transformation. I began to take inventory, like a detective in my own life. Each small humiliation was logged. Each unanswered message, each delayed smile, each sudden withdrawal, written down not as shame, but as evidence. And when I cataloged them, a pattern emerged. Here is what I discovered. The craving for approval is not weakness, it is conditioning. We are built to seek the eyes that turn away. Silence cuts deeper than insult because insult acknowledges your existence. Silence erases it. The body knows before the mind. The jitter in the chest, the clenched jaw, the shallow breath, these are signals. If you can name them before your mind tells its story, you rob the manipulator of half their power. So here is the exercise I gave myself, and now I give to you. The next time you feel that familiar hunger for a reply, pause. Do not ask why they have not answered. Ask instead, what does my body feel right now? Is it heat in the throat, an ache in the gut, a tightening in the jaw? Name it, write it, record the sensation without attaching a story. Because stories can be rewritten, feelings cannot be denied. I admit it was agony at first, the ledger filled with humiliations I wanted to forget. But once recorded, they lost their fog. Each entry was no longer a ghost haunting me, but a piece of data. And with data, you can see patterns. With patterns, you can predict. With prediction, you can refuse to react. That was the turning point. My observation sharpened into a blade. I stopped begging for resolution and started watching for rhythm. I stopped reacting to silence and started measuring its length. And once you can measure, you can mirror. Once you can mirror, you can withhold. Observation became strategy. And strategy, I learned, is where survival becomes control. Transition beat. I had stopped drowning in reaction. I had learned to float in the silence. And once you float, you can choose the current. The next step was no longer to endure. It was to act. I will not teach you how to control another human. That line is thin but vital. What I will do, what I owe you, is to show the architecture of the machine so you can step away from it. I speak now as someone who survived the curriculum of another's will and then learned to become my own teacher. The manipulator becomes here a case study, not a manual. Law 4. The echo trap. The manipulator rigs silence to echo. They repeat your phrases back to you not to understand, but to build a chamber where your words sound authoritative. When you hear your own confession returned with a different inflection, you trust it more. The echo validates you while redirecting you. You think the voice that repeats you is on your side. In truth, it is shaping the soundscape you must navigate. The trap is subtle because it feels like empathy. It is only empathy until your speech becomes the instrument of their influence. Law 5. Scarcity of presence. Presence is a resource. When someone withholds presence deliberately, they amplify the value of the moments they do give. Scarcity of presence is not mere busyness. It is curated absence. It makes brief proximity feel like rescue and long absence like penance. The mind begins to equate rare kindness with deep feeling, and memory overvalues the infrequent warmth while forgetting the steady erosion. Seen clinically, these tactics are predictable sequences. Proximity leads to reward. Reward leads to overinvestment. And withdrawal resets the appetite. Repeat. The pattern is a cycle of conditioning, not love. Seen poetically, it is a tide that pulls you out to sea with gentle, almost considerate hands. So how do you dismantle the effect without becoming cold or manipulative yourself? The answer is discipline, clarity, and small acts of procedural self-respect. First, record. Maintain a ledger of moments that felt off, dates, short quotes. The ledger is not for revenge. It is for reality. It turns fog into data. When your memory fights with evidence, evidence wins. Keep messages, save times, note the cadence of replies. Not to weaponize, but to re-anchor. Second, introduce friction to impulsive replies. Before you send any emotionally charged message, breathe 5 slow counts. Wait 2 minutes, walk away. Add a tiny step that interrupts the reflex. The manipulator depends on your instant hunger. Break the circuit. This is not strategy to control them. It is a safety rail for you. Third, rehearse neutral responses. Practice 3 phrases that do not inflame or plead, short, factual, unornamented. Use them until they feel natural. This reduces drama and denies the auctioneer the fuel of frantic emotion. Fourth, cultivate third-party reality checks. Tell one trusted friend the pattern you see and ask them to listen without advice. Sometimes the only antidote to being gaslit by charm is an external voice reminding you of what you already recorded. Practical. Non-actionable tools I used and recommend. Journaling prompts that focus on sensation, not story. What does my body feel when they delay? Breathing anchors, inhale 4, hold 4, exhale 6. Social experiments that test your perception. Deliberately delay a reply and note if the tone of the next interaction changes. These are not tests of them. They are measurements of the dynamic you are in. Measure without malice. Finally, cultivate small rituals of presence for yourself. Eat a meal without your phone. Walk alone for 20 minutes. Learn to sit with the ache that absence brings without filling it. Presence practiced on yourself dilutes the manipulator's power. Emotionally, these steps move you from reactivity to calm. At first, they feel like a cold calculus. Later, they feel like steadiness. The chest loosens. The mind stops rehearsing every possible ending. You taste your own time again, but be honest. Resistance invites escalation. When the manipulator recognizes that their auction has been interrupted, they sense a loss of currency. Tactics will intensify. Louder mirroring, grander gestures, sudden guilt, or passive aggression. This is not a failure on your part. It is the predictable friction of anyone losing influence. Prepare for it emotionally. Maintain your ledger. Keep your anchors. Do not mistake escalation for renewed affection. You have, in these defenses, no weapon against another's will, only shields for your own psyche. Wear them with the quiet dignity of a person reclaiming their attention. Escalation never arrives with a trumpet. It comes like weather, a gathering heaviness, a thickening of air, the sky bruising without warning. The manipulator, sensing loss, does not retreat. They tighten. They double down. The storm begins when influence falters, when the mirror no longer dazzles, when the echo no longer traps. They feel it. They sense the shift, and in their desperation they escalate. It spread first into my circle. Friends began to look at me differently, their eyes glazed with subtle doubt. Whispers carried half-truths. The manipulator had seeded stories, small distortions told in passing. He's paranoid. He overthinks everything. You know how sensitive he is. At first it felt minor, but perception shifts like ink in water. Soon I felt their glances as verdicts before I had even spoken. Gaslighting is never only private. It recruits the audience of your life. The conflict sharpened. Outside, I was pressured to conform, to explain, to doubt myself under the weight of social triangulation. Inside, I fought for steadiness. The more they tried to spin me, the more I pressed into stillness. But even stillness can be painted as guilt. The manipulator knows this. Silence is branded as sulking. Calmness is framed as arrogance. They build a trap where every move condemns you. The psychology of escalation is simple, but brutal. When control slips, fear awakens. Fear of abandonment, fear of losing the puppet strings, fear of exposure. That fear is quickly weaponized into shame. Shame is their lever, their chosen tool to force compliance. You are shamed for doubting, shamed for withdrawing, shamed for defending yourself. And in that fog of shame, they reclaim fragments of authority. There was one night that etched itself into my bones. A public gathering crowded loud. I made some harmless remark, nothing sharp, nothing critical. But she laughed, too loudly, too sharply, and turned my words into a performance. "You always think you're smarter than everyone," she announced, eyes darting to our friends, smiling with the cruelty of casual theater. The laughter that followed stung more than any knife. Not because the words carried truth, but because they carried spectacle. Public humiliation is the manipulator's thunderclap. It marks territory. It seeds doubt. It makes witnesses complicit. I went home silent, shaking, rehearsing my anger in the mirror. But when dawn came, so did the whisper. A soft voice, almost breaking. Apologies spilled like water. I don't know why I said that. I was just tired. You know I love you. This is escalation's twin face. Cruelty followed by tenderness. A cycle designed to disarm, to make you doubt your own memory, to chain humiliation to affection until you cannot tell them apart. The signs are always the same once you name them. Sudden crises appear out of nowhere, demanding immediate attention, manufactured urgency that forces you into reactive mode. Stories shift overnight, rewritten without acknowledgement, making you question whether you misheard the first telling. Minor disagreements become avalanches while real conflicts are buried under fog. It is chaos by design. Chaos keeps you grasping, keeps you dependent, keeps you orbiting their gravity. Here is what I learned to do when the storm swelled. Exit plans. Always know how to step away. A place you can go. A pretext you can use. Leave when escalation peaks. Distance is oxygen. Witness statements. Quietly confide in one person outside the circle. Record incidents while they are fresh. Write details, tone, timing, setting. Memory is fragile. Evidence is steel. Public boundaries. Do not play their theater. If humiliated in front of others, respond with brevity, not fire. A short phrase. That's not accurate. Then silence. Refusal to perform is your shield. Psychological reframes. Do not ask, why are they doing this? Ask, what does this tactic reveal about their fear? Shift the lens from your guilt to their desperation. It drains the poison of shame. And yet, let me admit the texture of this time. It was suffocating. Nights blurred with obsessive replay, lungs tight with the ache of betrayal. I watched someone I once trusted, someone whose smile I once sought, become a strategist of my undoing. That is the wound no advice can erase. The grief of realizing intimacy was a stage, and you were the script. But all storms, no matter how violent, reach a pivot. There comes a point when escalation cannot climb further without collapsing. A storm devours itself if it cannot bend you. The pivot is where mastery either breaks you or is reclaimed by you, and that pivot was coming. The end did not arrive with a scream. It came in slow motion, like glass falling from a table, the shimmer of light before the break. By then I was stripped to the essentials. No more frantic explanations, no rehearsed defenses, no hunger for resolution. Just me, bone, breath, presence, and her, the manipulator, suddenly exposed, not because I had caught her in a lie, but because the pattern had finally devoured itself. It was the accumulation of evidence, the ledger of betrayals now too heavy to ignore. It was the loss of audience, friends who once echoed her stories beginning to grow tired to look away. Patterns always unravel under repetition. The trick loses its luster when the magician repeats it too many times. The conflict that faced me was not whether she would stop. She would not. The conflict was mine. Do I retaliate, disappear, or transform? Retaliation promised the rush of fire, but fire burns both ways. Disappearance promised escape, but escape alone is not power. What remained was transformation, the internal law of refusal. This law is simple but brutal. The only true power is choosing yourself. Manipulation requires a tether. It feeds on reaction, on the sparks of attention, on your willingness to orbit. Refusal is not anger, not cruelty, not vengeance. Refusal is silence that cannot be bent, presence that cannot be bought. It fractures the game because it denies the currency. Detachment is the fracture point. Clarity is the immunization. I began to see the signs of her unraveling. Panic cues, subtle at first. Laughter pitched too high, words spilling too quickly, eyes darting for approval that no longer came. Overcompensation, sudden sweetness, gestures too grand, apologies rehearsed into theater. And finally, the shadow of abandonment. A coldness designed to punish but now brittle, no longer magnetic. What once felt like gravity now felt like absence. Here is the truth of closure. It is not something you receive. It is something you build. And there are ways to build it without harm. Documentation. Finalize your ledger. Not to hold a grudge, but to close the book. Evidence becomes boundary, calibrated distance. Not dramatic exits, not vanishing acts, just deliberate steps back. Less time, less response, less space for reaction. Distance does not need to be loud. It only needs to be consistent. Routine. Rebuild what was eroded. Morning rituals, steady meals. The simple act of choosing when you sleep. Manipulation thrives in chaos. Routine is your reclamation. Narrative. Decide your story, onto privately, or if needed, publicly. Speak what happened in clear language without venom. A narrative built on clarity robs the manipulator of their theater. The climactic moment was not a fight, not even words. It was a confrontation of silence. I sat across from her, her eyes scanning for familiar cracks, her smile bending into rehearsed softness. But I did not bite. I did not mirror. I did not ask or plead. I only remained. My refusal was not absence, but a presence too still to be moved. And in that silence, the game collapsed. Every tactic requires a reaction. Without one, the machinery grinds into nothing. That is how currency evaporates. That is how influence dissolves. The emotional pivot was sharp, almost jarring. Where once I had felt wound, I now felt reservoir. A deep well I could draw from, not to retaliate, but to sustain. My voice hardened, not cruel but certain. My reflection turned from lament into lesson, because that is what survival requires, not just to endure, but to translate. To alchemize wound into wisdom, chaos into structure, silence into strength. The storm had spent itself. What remained was not ashes, but ground firm enough to stand on, and that ground pointed forward, toward synthesis, toward the lesson that survives when the manipulator fades and the self remains. This story began as a confession. It ends as a lesson. I stand before you no longer as the fractured voice of doubt, but as something tempered, wary, luminous, carrying scars like scripture. I will not pretend the world has changed because I endured one manipulator. The truth is colder. The world is full of them. The work of vigilance never ends. But vigilance is not paranoia. It is clarity. It is learning to see the patterns before they write themselves into your bones. The 5 laws revealed along this path remain, not as weapons, but as warnings, as survival guides etched into memory. The quiet claim, influence often begins in silence. Defensive truth, notice who marks you without speaking. The mirror debt. Flattery binds you to repayment. Defensive truth. Every compliment is currency. Ask who profits. The attention auction. Whoever controls the spotlight controls the frame. Defensive truth. Decide where your gaze belongs before they decide for you. The echo trap. Repetition disguised as consensus. Defensive truth. Pause before mistaking volume for truth. The scarcity of presence. Withdrawal weaponized into hunger. Defensive truth. Absence is only power if you keep chasing it. Knowing these is not malicious. It is liberation. Knowledge allows you to step outside the stage, to refuse the script. Manipulation feeds on ignorance, on unguarded trust. Awareness does not make you cruel. It makes you sovereign. So remember the signs. The sudden crisis designed to force your hand. The shifting storyline that erases yesterday's truth. The whispers disguised as loyalty. The apologies rehearsed but never felt. They are signals. They are warnings. What you do with this knowledge matters. Use it to protect, not to dominate. Teach others what you now see. Fortify your mind, not as a fortress that isolates, but as a ground too steady to be stolen. Strength is not the ability to manipulate back. It is the choice never to bow to it again. And so I leave you with an image. A dim room, quiet, almost sacred. My voice fades, but a promise remains. Next time, we will dissect obsession's mirror. How to return attention without handing away power. Until then, carry this law as shield. What you see, you cannot be ruled by. A locked drawer holds the evidence of what was. Ahead, a horizon waits, not conquered, not feared, but quietly reclaimed.